Okay, so get ready for this, right? Because it's 1492 and Columbus is setting sail. But back in Spain, the Alhambra Decree, it throws everything into chaos.
And you know this, right, because you chose this deep dive. But for those who don't know, this leads to the expulsion of Spain's Jewish population.
Exactly, but it's way more than just upheaval, though, right? I mean, we're talking about a complete reshaping of the cultural landscape. Like, imagine, like, the depth of those roots, right? The intertwining of faith and identity over generations, and suddenly it's ripped apart. It's huge.
Absolutely, and it's crucial to understand this as a backdrop to the African diaspora.
And wasn't there something about the Pope giving Portugal the okay to basically enslave people in Africa around the same time? That can't be a coincidence, right?
It is absolutely not a
Yeah.
coincidence. So, while the expulsion from Spain was in full swing, Pope Nicholas V issues a series of papal bulls, right? And these bulls essentially give Portugal the green light to enslave anyone they found south of Cape Bojador in Africa. And the timing here is absolutely crucial.
Because it's right at the start of the transatlantic slave trade. Hold on. Are we saying that the foundation of that trade, the very justification for it, was intertwined with the persecution of these Afrohebraic communities?
Yeah, it's a complex connection, but when you lay it all out, the historical timeline is undeniable, right? The forced conversions, the expulsions, they weren't just about religion. These events created a population that was vulnerable, vulnerable to exploitation, vulnerable to being swept up in the burgeoning slave trade.
Okay, but the Edict of Expulsion itself, it's not exactly light reading. What were the key things that jumped out at you? What drove this whole thing?
Well, it's really interesting because it's steeped in the language of fear-mongering. They're blaming Jewish communities for everything, from like economic woes to undermining the Catholic faith.
Wow.
They even accuse them of trying to convert Christians, which is a little ironic given what happened next.
Okay, so maybe not converting, but what about the forced conversions that did happen? That feels like a huge piece of this story.
It was a calculated strategy to maintain power. By forcing these conversions and expulsions, the ruling class, they weren't just targeting religious beliefs, they were eliminating a perceived threat, consolidating their own control. And for Afro-Hebraic communities, this created a whole new level of complexity.
Yeah, because they weren't just navigating faith at that point. They were navigating their very existence in a society where race was already becoming a defining factor.
And we see this reflected in the way they navigated their expulsion and exile.
Mm.
Many ended up in Portugal thinking that they'd found refuge.
But history, as we know, has a way of repeating itself because they faced persecution there too, right? Like jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. What happened to them in Portugal?
Yeah, it really is a case of history repeating itself, sadly. They were hit with forced conversions, and their descendants became known as Black Portuguese Israelites. And then their story becomes very much intertwined with the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade.
So they're caught in this web of religious persecution, forced conversions, and then on top of it all, they're being swept up in the slave trade. It's just like, wow. To think about the resilience it must have taken to hold on to their identity through all of that.
And it doesn't end there because it gets even more complex. So imagine being exiled to these islands, São Tomé and Príncipe. They're off the coast of Africa.
Okay.
And you're carrying this blend of cultures, of traditions, trying to make sense of it all in a new and unfamiliar land.
So we're not just talking about the physical journey of across continents, but like a journey of the soul, right? Trying to hold on to who you are in the face of so much change, so much upheaval.
Precisely. And what's remarkable is that they did hold on. They blended their heritage with African traditions, and it created this really rich tapestry of culture that continues to this day. They're known as Afro-Portuguese now. And honestly, their story really challenges these rigid categories we often use to define ourselves.
It makes you think about how much of history is about survival, about adaptation. And it's not always pretty, but it's like a real testament to the human spirit, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. What we see with the Afro-Portuguese is that culture isn't static. It's not about clinging to the past, but about finding ways to make it meaningful in the present.
Yeah.
Even when faced with unimaginable circumstances.
Okay, but let's talk about the elephant in the room here. So the source material for this deep dive, it makes this really bold claim. It argues that a lot of the people we think of as African slaves were actually descended from Israelites, and that's a perspective you don't hear every day.
It's a perspective that forces us to really confront some uncomfortable truths, about how history is written, about the narratives that have been used to justify oppression. Because for centuries, the slave trade was built on the dehumanization of Africans. But if we acknowledge the historical evidence pointing towards a significant Israelite presence amongst those enslaved, it dismantles that justification.
So it's not just about adding another layer to the story. It's about rethinking the very foundation of the transatlantic slave trade and understanding the role that religious persecution played in shaping that horrific chapter of history.
And let's be clear here, recognizing this connection doesn't diminish the suffering of other African communities who were also caught in the web of slavery. It simply adds another layer of complexity to a truly horrific system, and it highlights that oppression often wears many masks.
It's like you were saying earlier, it's about recognizing the interconnectedness of it all. We can't fully understand one part of history without understanding how it connects with others.
Exactly. And when we start to make those connections, we begin to see that the fight for justice and equality isn't confined to one group or one historical event. It's an ongoing struggle against systems of oppression that still continue to this day.
You know, it's interesting because we've talked a lot about the darkness of this history, the persecution, the expulsion, the horrors of the slave trade. But I keep coming back to the Afro-Portuguese story and their resilience, their ability to create something new and vibrant out of such brutal circumstances. It gives me a lot to think about. It really makes you think about the power of the human spirit, to face down like centuries of oppression and still find a way not just to survive, but to thrive.
It's incredible. And what I find so fascinating is how they navigated the intersection of their identities, because they were descendants of Israelites, but living in Africa, surrounded by these different cultures, different belief systems. So it makes you wonder how they held on to their heritage while adapting to these new realities.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle, right? Trying to put all the pieces together. How do you maintain that sense of self in the middle of so much change?
It is. It really is. But what we see is this remarkable capacity for blending and innovation. The Afro-Portuguese, they didn't just abandon their traditions. They wove them together with African influences to create something totally unique and new.
It really highlights how dynamic culture is, how it can adapt and evolve while still staying true to its core.
And it reminds us that identity itself is fluid, that it's multifaceted and shaped by our experiences. The Afro-Portuguese story, it challenges these rigid categories we try to put ourselves and others into.
Because, yeah, at the end of the day, we're all products of our histories, right? And those histories are way more intertwined than we often realize.
That's exactly right. And the deeper we dive into these untold stories, the better we understand how interconnected our world truly is.
It makes you wonder how many other stories are still waiting to be discovered, hidden in the margins of history. And what can those stories teach us about ourselves, about the world?
I think those are the questions we need to be asking. And we may not have all the answers, but by exploring these hidden histories, shining a light on those overlooked narratives, it opens us up to new perspectives. And that leads to a much richer understanding of the human experience.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the royal courts of Spain to the shores of Africa, uncovering a story that's heartbreaking, but also deeply inspiring. We've explored the lasting consequences of persecution and the slave trade, but also the remarkable resilience of those who were displaced and forgotten.
But even with all of that darkness, there are glimmers of hope. The Afrohebraic story, their perseverance, their ability to blend cultures and endure, it's a testament to the strength of the human spirit. And it's a reminder that even when facing unimaginable hardships, hope can still exist.
It's a story that should inspire all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about our shared history, to question the narratives we've been told, and embrace a more inclusive and nuanced understanding of the world around us.
It reminds us that the fight for justice and equality, well, it continues today. And we all have a part to play in dismantling the systems of oppression that still exist in our world.
This deep dive may be over, but I hope our conversation continues. What will you do with the knowledge you've gained today? What stories will you seek out? And how will you use your voice to help create a more just